My name is David Cheetham, and I'm the reader in philosophical theology here at the University of Birmingham. I'm also the head of the School of Philosophy, Theology and Religion as well, and I'm also the programme lead for the BA in Philosophy, Religion and Ethics. Some of you might be doing that, I don't know. Happy to take questions at the end, maybe if you've got any questions about that programme. So it's not surprising that the lecture I thought I would give you today, or the taster lecture, is to do with something really pretentious, like the question of meaning. And by that I mean something like the meaning of life, a really big question. And the question really I have to ask today is whether it's a genuine question, or whether it's a question which any of you have any interest in whatsoever, whether it's a question which is really something to be put off to the future, or whether it's a question which is relevant for you today. And certainly one of the things we do in this part of the philosophy, religion and ethics is we consider the ways in which different religions and different cultures and different parts of the world address this particular question. Because for some people the question comes in an entirely different form than the one you might be expecting. It may be framed differently. It may be framed as a collective question about you and everybody else, or you and your family. Whereas in the West we tend to frame things very individually. And there's a question also about how deep do you need to go? So I bet you the question of your life at the moment is, should I come to Birmingham University? Or will I get the necessary grades for my A-levels to get into my desired university? Or is this the right course? Those are the right questions for you at the moment. So if I say to you, what is the meaning of life? You might say, oh, hang on a bit. I haven't got there yet. I'm more interested in what's the meaning of whether I should go to university or not. And that's a very interesting point, you see, because how deep does the question of meaning go? How profound is the question? In the West, our ideas of what are the big questions are rather determined by the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, great philosophers like Plato, for example. And the Greeks tended to see things in terms of archetypes. That is to say, they seem to think that the real answer to the question was about getting beneath the surfaces of things, of trying to get down into the depths, to get underneath questions to find out those particular answers. That was their prejudice. They call the philosophy of the archetype. And the great philosopher Plato came up with the idea of something called the ideal form. I don't know if any of you have ever come across that idea, but that was a classic idea of Plato known as the ideal form. And what he meant by that was that the way that we look at the world is that we have in our minds a series of kind of principles or blueprints, so that when we see things, we recognize what they are. Let me give you a really trivial example. So take chairs. How do you know it's a chair when you see it? Because if you think about chairs, there are lots of different kinds of chairs. Some chairs have cushions. Some chairs have 3 legs. Some chairs have 4 legs. Some chairs are stools, I suppose. Is that a kind of chair? But your mind never goes through that kind of routine. That's what Plato's point is. You never come across different chairs and say that's a different object from that object, because you have in your mind a concept, don't laugh, called chairness. There's something in your mind, so that every time you see something that looks vaguely like a chair, or maybe has 3 legs or 4 legs, you automatically know it's something to be sat on. You have a principle in your head, so that every time you come across, even if they're wildly different, you somehow recognize, oh, that's a chair, even though they're very different. And Plato thought that, well, that's because there's an ideal blueprint of a chair in your mind, or there's an ideal blueprint of the perfect chair in the heavenly realms, or in the nous, as he called it, in the world of the mind. That's the first thing that has dominated Western thought, the idea of the archetype, that really the surfaces are not important, it's what is beneath the surfaces, or the principles behind those surfaces that are really important. Another kind of prejudice is this, that the West has, is the idea of simplification. The idea that we can get a complex idea and boil it down to its basic principles. That we must get down to the fundamentals of what something is about. So we look at complexity and we say, oh, this can't be the whole story. We have to go deeper to find out what the basic principles are. So when we say, what is the meaning of life? When we're asking sort of really big questions, well, maybe that's the point, is that we tend to think in terms of what's underneath. So if you give the answer, what's the meaning of life? Well, get married, have kids, whatever. Some people might say, oh yeah, but what is the real meaning of life? And for some people, well, that's just enough. Why does there have to be anything more than that? Is it because there's a kind of a sense within our religions and also within the predominant ideas of Western philosophy that have dominated our thinking for so long that have tended to presuppose that there must be something underneath the surface? Now, some people said the question is not genuine because it's not actually meant to be a question that receives a real answer. So if you ask somebody the question, what is the meaning of life? They might say, well, I didn't really mean it. I was just being rhetorical. It's rather like telling someone to get lost. You don't mean just you don't find your way, you just mean go away. Or if somebody says to you, oh, you have no soul, it doesn't mean you don't have this gaseous substance inside of you. It means that you somehow lack depth, or you lack basic humanity. Basically, we use metaphors all the time, and sometimes when people ask questions, this is what Ludwig Wittgenstein thought, the great philosopher of the 20th century, that our language sometimes ties us up in knots to make them think that we're asking real questions which have real objects of study. Or take this famous statement by Winston Churchill. He said this, "What then, fellow countrymen, once the enemy is vanquished, can we not accomplish in our hour of victory?" Classic Churchill. But he doesn't mean, oh, we can accomplish anything. He just means to just buoy people up. He means to encourage them. It's not a genuine question. It's merely a rhetorical device designed to beef people along and keep them going. And this is the whole question about the meaning of life. When we ask that question, is it a genuine question that we can say, oh, found it, there it is, buried underneath that chair over there, the meaning of life? Can it be discovered in quite that way? Well, some religions claim that is the case, as you'll see in a second. That truth is not something which you experience or you fathom by reading lots of books. I shouldn't really say that as a lecturer, really, should I? But rather you find truth because it comes and introduces itself to you instead. And you would never have known it unless it walked into the room. That's a different kind of way of looking at meaning, that you don't even know what you need yet until it walks in the door. So, is it about depth? But what about the shallows? What about the surfaces of life? Why aren't they just as profound in some ways as the depths that we claim are beneath them? Now, who's this guy? Oh, I've already given it away. Sorry. Damn. David Hume. Yes. I wasn't meant to press the second button. Anyone come across David Hume? Anyone doing philosophy? So you'll know he's a real skeptic about just about everything. But the best people to read, in terms of real good skepticism or atheism, I suppose, is David Hume, because he writes some pretty annihilating stuff. But he's very clear about what he thinks is the criterion for meaning. So he thinks that anything to do with poetry or anything to do with sort of religion in particular, don't bother with it because it's really just poetry in the end. It has no factual merit about it at all. And so he famously said, well, if you read a book and it contains no experiments or no scientific claims or no verifiables, then just dump it, he says, just discard it. It can't be worth much. And this was very influential for a whole 20th century movement known as positivism. And positivism was basically the idea that you shouldn't really buy into anything that isn't capable of being verified or falsified. And that statements are only meaningful if you can verify or falsify them. So if I say, there is a pen next door, can someone go and fetch it for me? Hume would say you're making a meaningful statement because it means you can actually literally go next door and find out whether that's a meaningful statement. So there is either a pen next door or there isn't. But if I say to you, does she love you? Or does he love you? Or what is the good? Hume says, well, you could never find out what that would mean. You could never verify or falsify that. Therefore, consign it to the flames. Don't bother with such questions. Now, already you can see there's a problem with that, isn't there? In the search for precise meaning, maybe we end up eliminating a whole range of meanings that we know make sense. We know it makes sense to say to somebody, I love you. We know it makes sense to say, oh, it was a good thing that that person did. We know what we mean is the claim. And so for people like Hume to come along and say, yes, but can you test it? Can you boil it in a test tube? The point is this, is he setting the bar too high? Has he ended up eliminating all the other meanings just because he wants to somehow get rid of the religious meaning in particular? And so there are different aspects of meaning, aren't there? There's what you call meaningful lives, and there's the meaning of life. And so you all, I presume, want meaningful lives. That's why you're here. I presume you wouldn't be here wanting to do a degree if you didn't believe in somehow that you wanted your life to have some kind of purpose or meaning. So there is the micro level of meaning that makes so much sense within a horizon of our own finitude. We're going to live and die or whatever. It's very interesting, they did a study recently to ask this question about whether the meaning of life was still a valid question in the 21st century for young people. Because some of you in this room will probably live way, way beyond your hundreds. Whereas people like me maybe won't. But people like you, because of all the advanced technologies that we have, and maybe all the consciousness about healthy eating and all that sort of stuff, maybe that's not so important. But certainly the medicine will somehow allow you to live for as long as you want. I guarantee it. They're already really getting that way already. Now think about that. Think about the cultural effects of that particular change. It means that in a way the question of what happens, or maybe there is a life after death, or maybe there is a bigger meaning, will disappear into the horizon. Similarly, you're concerned about limited horizons. You know, will I get a degree? Should I do this? Will I find a lifelong partner? Will I get a good career? All those sort of questions, which are time focused. They're about 5 or 10 or maybe 15 years ahead of you. But maybe that's as far as we go as human beings. We can't go much further than that. And so maybe we can talk about meaningful lives. I want to do this, I want to get married, I want to do that, I want to get a good career, I want to do all kinds of, those are meaningful goals, possibly. But the meaning of life might be just too big a question. And then the other thing is about then the significance of things. Is how significant are events in your life? What kind of premium do you give the basic significance? But the significance is this. So imagine you go on holiday and you're on a beach or wherever, and somehow just around the corner comes your friend or your next door neighbour. Some of you, that will fill you with great horror, probably, when you're trying to get away from your next door neighbour. But imagine that they turn up on the same resort as you turn up to. Now, some of you will do this. You'll say, "Whoa, what a coincidence. Fancy you being here." That will be the significance of the event for you. Life's just like that. It throws random stuff at you. Others of you will say, "My goodness, there must be a purpose. There must be a timing that's so perfect. There must be a reason why we came together. What are the odds of meeting you on this same time in this same place? There must be a design behind it." Now, some people say that the point behind that is that we have a lot of freedom regarding how we interpret the significance of events. For some of us, coincidence make all the difference. And for others, there is a definite teleology or design behind those particular significances. And we have a lot of freedom to decide how to interpret those. I was visited a couple of months ago by a civil servant. This is the question, by the way, is my degree going to be useful? So I was visited by a civil servant who came to see me and said, would I be interested in suggesting some people who would go down and sit on a government think tank to talk about the deeper meanings that we need to cultivate for our society today. Because, not surprisingly, as you might guess, the government doesn't have an idea about what it wants to do about value and meaning in society. It knows about money and finance, or it knows all about that, but it doesn't know so much about value. And so the question I was being asked, the government anxieties, is about meaning for society. And this is the problem, you see, because some great philosophers have asked the question, how do all these people with different meanings of life live together? And I bet you there's about 10 or 15 different meanings of life in this room today. How do we get you to coexist? How do we get you to live? Now, some people think, oh, it's okay, leave religion out of it. Stuff all the meaning into the private domain and leave the public domain free of religion and free of comprehensive commitments. Instead, let's just be reasonable. And the problem with that, as government finds, is that if you take away the meaning from the public square, well, you've taken away meaning. You've taken away the reason why people want to do stuff, why they want to be good, why they want to say, yes, you should do this. And people say, well, why should I do that? Well, because, well, what? Precisely. And so government is asking the question, how do we cultivate meaning in the public square when there is a multicultural situation at hand? What are the values we all share? What are the meanings we all share? It's a genuine question. And what I've just put above here, the question more compelling today, a postmodern anxiety, the end of the grand meta-narrative. Sounds profound stuff. Well, there was a great thinker called Francis Fukuyama who wrote a book called The End of History and the Last Man. And he basically kind of said that, well, it's as if history's run its course. We knew about 50 or 60 years ago, because it was a very scientifically dominated intellectual sphere. We thought we knew what facts were. We thought we knew what societies should do. Societies were far more monocultural, perhaps. But now, in the postmodern world, the postmodernity basically means difference. It means that there's lots and lots and lots and lots of different things. And the question is, what do you do with all that difference? I mean, once you've arrived at a place where you have so much choice about meaning, you don't have to say, what do my parents think? Or is this society, does it agree on all the same things? Because apparently, one of the great virtues of our society is diversity. We seem to champion that as the chief value, if you notice. Diversity, all that sort of stuff. So diversity is a value, but what does that look like in terms of purpose and meaning? What it means is choice. It means lots and lots and lots and lots of choice. And so really it leads to an anxiety of a surplus of meaning. Not just no meaning, but too much meaning. And so the question is what to do in today's society with all these multiple meanings. So some people say, as you might be not surprised given the fact that it's about religion as well, that the meaning is transcendent. That is to say that the true source of meaning, rather like what Plato was saying, but not quite the same thing, he was talking more about the intellect. But some people will say, well, meaning comes from above. Simple as that. Where do we get the certainties from? Well, it must come from outside of the flux of life. It must come out from beyond, from further afield. And there was a great thinker called Blaise Pascal. Some of you may have heard of him. And he said something like this. He said, the individual tries in vain to fill everything around him, seeking in things that are not there the help he cannot find in those that are, though none can help, since this infinite abyss can only be filled but with an infinite and immutable object, in other words, by God himself. So Pascal has come up with one of those classic things that you often hear, often from preachers possibly, is that human beings have this infinite hole, this infinite yearn for something that will fill it. And it has to, therefore, it'll never be ever filled, if you know what I mean, except by the infinite. It can't be filled by anything else, because it's infinitely huge. Now some people say, well, that's Pascal's point, that in some ways, and this is the point made by a number of philosophers and theologians, they say that, well, the answer must come from outside of the human sphere because it transcends the human sphere. The question's too big to be answered by humanity alone. And that's Pascal's point. He says that there's a voracious appetite that human beings have for multiple meanings, but however varied it is or however multiplied it is, it doesn't satisfy. Now, of course, Pascal has a problem with that, Pascal's thinking, because, of course, he's assuming that, how does he know that a finite being like a human being has an infinite need? Is that just Humean poetry again? Oh, the need is infinite. Is it genuine, that? Or is it just very big? Is it go on forever? Or is it just go on for a long, 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 long time, our particular needs? This is the question. How large does the answer need to be to satisfy? And Pascal just throws out an infinite need. Well, that might be his bit of poetry there. Maybe what he really means, it just needs to be very big. And that's a question you should need to ponder about how much satisfies the question. Is it very big? Or does it have to be bigger than anything else? Or even further than that, does it have to be infinitely big? And how do human beings know that, given the fact they're not infinite themselves? There's only so much you can stuff inside the human body, I presume, or inside your mind. Well, maybe there's a finite answer to the big question. That's a question you could think about. Another thinker called Karl Rahner, I don't know if any of you have heard of him, but he was a thinker of the 20th century who was the chief architect behind one of the major councils in the Vatican Church called Vatican II. And he had this whole idea of he said that it's more natural for a human being to be supernatural than it is for them to be purely natural. That's a bit of a tongue twister, isn't it? It's more natural for you to be supernatural than it is for you to be just natural. And he said this, well, rather, there was a thinker here, Karen Kilby, who was in our department, and she writes this really short book on Karl Rahner, about 90 pages long. You can read it in about 2 hours. It's really well written. And she gives this analogy. She says this, she says, what Rahner is trying to say is that because God is so prevalent, so obvious, that's his view, you may disagree, you can't help but take into account into your day-to-day lives the fact of this particular horizon that's always there, though you never acknowledge it. Now, Rahner's point is simply this, is that it's somehow the belief in God, or the horizon, of God on the horizon, as it were, in your minds, is what makes you have a purpose in your life, why you think it's worth getting out of bed in the morning. Maybe you don't think that's worthwhile. Or whether it's worthwhile going to work, or going to lectures, or getting a degree. I mean, why do you bother with all that stuff? You know how it ends. And yet you do. You want a job. You want to do these other things with your lives. And Rahner says, well, the reason why you do that is because there's this horizon where you think you sort of got to say to yourself, it'll be all right in the end. It's all going to turn out fine. There is a bigger purpose after all. This is the horizon. And what Karen Kilby, my colleague, said, it's not like as if you're climbing up Mount Everest. And it takes a long time to climb up Mount Everest. And so it's different from climbing up any old hill like the Brecon Beacons, which takes you about half a day. But Everest takes about 3 or 4 weeks. And in the process of climbing up that huge mountain, you might forget the mountain's even there. But you'll be still putting one foot in front of the other and stopping by campsites. You can't always keep on looking up for the 3 or 4 weeks. And so you start to look down, you start to talk to your friends, but you're all heading in some direction. You're moving towards it. It's over there, something. Oh yeah, it's Everest. You know what I mean? But because it's 3 or 4 weeks ahead, it's not the immediate point of conversation. Now Rahner says that's God, you see. That's the reason why we all put one foot in front of the other, why we make our lives have meaning, why we go from one step to the other and try to get better and better, or whatever it is we're trying to do. So he calls that, and of course, most philosophers, as you know, like to think of nice big words when they have a good idea. And he's no exception, so he calls this the supernatural existential. Posh stuff. But basically it means that somehow that our whole existence is somehow got fused within it, this basic horizon. Now I said a minute ago that I don't know if any of you have seen a film called Total Recall. God. Or Memento. That was another one, wasn't it? There's a really dark movie, which I don't know whether any of you have seen, called Angel Heart. But the basic story behind these things is that these people, these characters in these films, don't know what they've done because their memories have been erased. And so their true identity is concealed from them until some terrible moment in the film where somebody says, this is your true brain. Let me put it back inside you. Ah, that's what I did. And so it turns out that in Total Recall, the hero has a wife he never knew about because his mind's been erased. It turns out in another film, the guy turns out to have been a murderer. But of course, he's changed his identity and somebody had wiped his memories. But the point of that is simply, now why am I saying all that in the context of this, is that sometimes the meaning of life arrives unbeckoned, or as a surprise, or as an intervention, rather than something you're looking for. So you could spend hours and hours and hours and hours, or centuries maybe, in the library, and you still wouldn't get anywhere close to the answer to the meaning of life. Because if the meaning of life is something that's meant to drop out of the sky, so it surprises you, that's another model for meaning. So there's other models we've talked about career and life and so on. But some of the monotheistic traditions, like Islam, Christianity and Judaism, is that meaning is given. It arrives as a surprise. It's like a revelation. A book turns up, Holy Writ. A person turns up and says, I am he, or whatever it might be. But it's totally discontinuous with anything that might be part of your knowledge. You could never read about Jesus Christ in a book. You could never read about the Quran by learning philosophy. It just turns up, if you know what I mean. And another thing to say is this, that's one aspect of it, is that therefore God, the idea of the theistic traditions is that God lands meaning. But there's the other idea that somehow that also our meaning requires God in order to give it shape. Has anybody ever seen those Christmas decorations that kind of hang from the ceiling? And these kind of like, they're like kind of disco balls sort of thing. They're kind of springy things, but when you collapse them down, they collapse flat into a pack. Do you know what I mean? Those kind of spiral things that become round-shaped. I'm using great analogies today, I know. But that's the idea that somehow, while they're all flat packed, they don't look very interesting. But when you hook them up to the ceiling, they become three-dimensional. So some views of meaning take that form. They say that, well, meaning, this is the view of the great philosopher Thomas Aquinas. He said that we get our meaning because it participates in the divine. It's like as if God is blowing up the balloon and making it have shape. And so the question of meaning then becomes something which God inflates or bestows and therefore transforms an object that is rather immanent and flat into three dimensions instead. That's another view of meaning, very theistic, Semitic view of meaning. But then you go east and they say, well, no, it's not about things dropping out of the sky. It's not about revelation in that sense that you don't know about it. It's about thinking towards self-improvement. And so at the root of Hinduism and Buddhism, for example, is how do I experience joy? How do I have a joyous life? Not happy. Happy is different. Happy is not the same as joy. Happiness comes and goes. Joy is continuous. You can be joyous, allegedly, through times of great suffering. But happiness comes and goes. And so you might say that the search for Hindus and for Buddhists in particular is some kind of inner, we've got it right. And I put here the third thing down on your hand on this thing is the problem of being out of tune. That sums up really the kind of the Eastern perspective that somehow the world is doing one thing and we've got to somehow get in with the flow of it. And so you might achieve that through meditation. Because what's at the root of the Eastern perspective, rather like for Plato, is education. Is that somehow peace and truth comes through learning. Which is different if you remember from the Islam and Christianity and Judaism, which is learning comes through revelation. Whereas for the Eastern traditions, learning comes through meditation. It comes through pondering on the nature of reality. And you see that overcoming ignorance, avidya, within Hinduism is the whole point. And that's what Plato thought. Plato thought that the way you heal society is you educate it. So you would get people to stop being criminals if you educated them. And it's a kind of a basic principle that went sort of into the East to influence Eastern thinking as well, that somehow that if we see things right, if we see that everything is one or whatever it is, we attain some kind of tranquility or serenity. And it's very interesting that for the Buddhists, for example, this is the question, whether we're in search for the permanence or the flux. Now remember that question I asked right at the beginning of the lecture about whether meaning is somehow down deep in the depths or whether it's beneath the surface. That also presupposes another kind of metaphysic or ontology. It presupposes that we're in search of something that stands still. That's the prejudice of Parmenides of the Greeks, who was in search of being. But there was another thinker called Heraclitus. Does anyone know what Heraclitus famously said? Anyone know? It's too late in the afternoon, I know, and the sun's shining. It's tiring stuff. Heraclitus said, you can't step into the same river twice. Why? Because his principle wasn't being, it was becoming. It was flux. Everything changes. And the Buddhist will say to you, your problem, why you're so unhappy, is because you're in search of permanence. When the truth is, flux. Everything is on the move, everything's changing. And so the Buddhist is trying to persuade you to go with the flow, to let go of yourself, to let go of the idea that there's a God, and go with the flux. A Hindu is rather like trying to say, well, if you meditate, try to find the deeper Atman, or the deeper oneness that stands still. Different kind of persuasions, but the same sort of approach. That meaning is through experience, meaning is through learning, and you achieve that through practice and through meditation. I haven't got much time left, so maybe I will just finish with this bit here, is that some people say, well, oh, that's all very boring. Because really, meaning shouldn't be about, I want to be a good person. Because this lady here, called Susan Wolfe, said, what about other goods? What about being a great chef? What about being a great pianist? What about being a great tennis player? What about those people who say, I want to win the 100 meters and be the fastest in the world? And what Susan Wolfe says, she says, well, if you spend all your life trying to be good, you'll never be a great chef. Because you'll think that's a waste of your time. You'll think that's not the point. If you spend all your time bothering about sort of the great purposes in life, what about the medium purposes in life? What's so wrong about being the fastest runner on earth? What's so wrong about being the greatest maker of lasagna or curry on the earth, if you know what I mean? And now she doesn't want to be cheeky or churlish about it, but the question is very clear, isn't it? Is that sometimes the good drowns out other goods, non-moral goods. And these are all parts of the questions then that show you, I hope, that the meaning of life is a very complex issue, difficult to know where to start sometimes, but these are the kinds of things I think that are the primary questions that face us today. Thank you very much.